it's a pleasure to talk to Kevin. Kevin, as you know, works at the Y in Greater Pittsburgh. And we're just going to have a conversation for a little while. I'll ask Kevin a little about the work he's doing. I'm going to ask him about the community in Pittsburgh and how it's doing. And then we'll open it up for your questions and your comments. This is meant to be informal and just a conversation between people who are weaving community. So Kevin, let me start just a simple biographical question. Where'd you grow up and how'd you get to do the kind of work you're doing?
Yeah, David, hey, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. Where did I start? Home for me is Lynchburg, Virginia. Small little place in the middle of Virginia. I like to say it's about 2 hours away from everything that's really important. But it was a good place, and it was a good place to grow up and to have values that were set. Lynchburg was great for me. I went from Lynchburg to move around to a few different places after that. But Lynchburg, Virginia is my home place and a place I get back to a couple times a year now.
Yeah, and did you have an early image of what community looked like there? I went to a summer camp for the same one for 15 years, and that was like my image of what community is all my camp friends that I had from age 8 to 22.
Yeah. I think community to me was defined a whole lot by my little small neighborhood. When I was in Lynchburg, we lived in two different places on two different parts of the city. And in Lynchburg, people would say this was two major parts of the city, but it's only about a 15-minute bike ride apart. But how those communities were orchestrated and how they kind of came together was completely different. The second place that we lived at was just blocks away from the home that my mom and my aunts and uncles went to, where they grew up at. And growing up in that community, the same community that they grew up in, immediately kind of locked me into a community that knew me, that looked out for me. People who said, "Oh, you're Thelma's son. I know you." So, whether or not I had met those people or not, they knew me from my mother and from my aunts and uncles.
Yeah, that's where trust comes from. I was talking about social trust. They know if you do something wrong, Thelma's going to look after you. And so when you were growing up, did dream of becoming a Y director? Was that in your head, or were you thinking something else?
No, nothing close to it. I think very few of us in the YMCA grow up and say, "Hey, I want to grow up and run a YMCA." It becomes, as most of us would say, it's a bit of a calling. You get brought into this work by something a whole lot higher than you. In my position, I was actually running an after-school enrichment program for minority sixth graders. I was loving that work. It was extremely meaningful work to me, and someone had approached me and said, "Well, you should volunteer for this local YMCA," and I was doing that at the time. And shortly after that, someone said, "Well, you should consider running this Y." And it was a very, very small YMCA organization, $115,000 budget. And I remember telling the person, I said, "Well, I don't know anything about that Y. I don't know anything about how to run a Y." And they said, "Well, frankly, neither did the person before him." So, give it a shot. And, long story short, it has ended up being a wonderful experience for me of some now 26 years.
Yeah. And well, the first calling, it sounds like, was to run that school program for the kids. Yeah. There was some sense that, is it something that grew out of your own experience, or just felt this is what society needs?
The school program for me was very transformational for me. But I go back to one particular song that I will always remember. When I was thinking about whether or not to work for the Y, I was talking with a friend of mine. I had a friend named James, and I said, "Hey, James, I'm thinking about whether or not to take this opportunity to work for this Y." I said, "I don't know anything about the Y. I don't know anything about what it takes to run a Y." And I said, "But I have this song that I keep thinking about." It was by a group called Orlando Draper and the Associates Choir. It was a gospel song. And it had at the very beginning to it said, "Stand up for right, join in the fight, be a soldier." And it talked about how communities are just under the siege of war, and it's our job to really stand up. And I told him about that, and I didn't hear him say anything. And I said, "James, are you still there?" And he said, "Well, man, I'm being quiet." He said, "God's trying to talk to you. You're not listening, so I don't want to make any more noise." And after that, I applied for the job the next day.
Yeah. A lot of pastors could take that lesson, sitting and letting God do a little talking. And so what about the why? Explain to us the why as a system. A lot of us know it as a gym, but it does so much more than that.
Yeah, the why is so much more than just a gym or swim. I think nowadays, especially over the last 2 months, when the gym and swim aspect has been stripped away from the work that we do, it's compelled many people in the community to see the work that has always been going on that Wise are doing. Wise are uniting communities. Wise are finding ways to meet the needs. Wise are finding ways to serve people in the community who don't have a voice, who don't have an advocate for them. We all do it in different ways based upon the needs of those communities. And the thing that really keeps me with the organization and has kept me with the organization over this period of time is I can't think of anything else I would rather do, any organization that I'd rather work with that gives me the flexibility to do this work, to do it with a certain degree of creativity, and also has so many allies across the community who want to see us advance the work. So the why, we always say that the why looks different in every community that you go to, and that's the beauty of it and why I love it.
Yeah, this is something I think about is back in the 19th century, I think the Y was founded or maybe around the 1850s or something like that. They were really good at founding national chapter-based organizations that had the strength of a national brand, but where everything was local. And at some point in the 30s, you know, a third of all American men were members of the Rotary Club or the Elks Club. And those sorts of organizations, somehow we've lost the ability to build those. We have a lot of really good small organizations, but the big national alliances, somehow we've lost the ability. I'm not sure why that is. I don't really understand it.
Yeah. You know, it's the why, I believe, is a really interesting thing. And you know, the point that you talk about the Rotary clubs and this and that, you know, I always like to believe that in many ways we're helping to build that next wave of true philanthropists in our communities. You know, when I was growing up, my mother, my father, you know, none of the people who were involved in my life early on took me to a Rotary club and introduced me to any of that. And so, you know, especially when I get a chance to talk with my peers across the country, and frankly, my other African-American peers across the country, I always look at it as it's our job now to build this next wave of philanthropists across the country, people who can get involved and get engaged in their community, people who are looking for a different way of leading, like we've seen in many Rotary and Optimist clubs across the country.
Yeah. So describe to us the Pittsburgh why. What are some of the challenges? What are the focuses? And what are the needs?
Well, the challenges today are many. You know, I've been here for 10 years and through a variety of different roles. I've been in the CEO role for now almost the last 4. But in that period of time, through a variety of different roles, I've tried to get us to a point where we could be responsible for earning our revenue, where we could move away from some of the softer dollars that are out there. And I always believed that that was a good business model to move to. I never imagined that we'd get to a position like we are today where we're not allowed to earn our revenue. So that's a real challenge for us now. We've had the ability the ability to earn the revenue that sustains the organization has been taken away. Thankfully, the good work that we have done and continue to do in the community has endeared us to a really supportive foundation community that continues to support us. But we know that that's not a long-standing model, that we still do operate on a model that is more heavily based on facilities, and those facilities have cost. And so while the challenge that we have is trying to figure out how we move forward. I was on a call just a couple of days ago with some of our camp leaders, and they are desperate to try to figure out how they can provide service in the community this year, but we don't know if we're going to be allowed to, or to what degree. I was on another call with another YMCA leader just earlier today and talking about how and when she can open up her YMCA, and we said, don't know how, don't know when. So the challenge now that I think that we see and that everyone else sees probably on this line is the challenge of the unknown, and trying to operate within that space while also trying to build some trust from the community standpoint that we're still going to be here. The Y has made it through numerous different types of catastrophes over over 175 years. We'll make it through it, but we'll have to be a whole lot smarter and different as we start to look for whatever that different is going to be.
Yeah, I had a parent friend who said if they close summer camps, I'm marching on City Hall. I can't take it.
Right.
So what are the specific services you're offering now? Are there food? Is there any online tutoring or stuff like that?
Yeah, the Pittsburgh Y has always been really connected to the community beyond health and wellness. We've always had a very strong stance in our social service programming. Today, we still have 105 men who live at one of our YMCA's. We always tell people in the community that these men are not homeless, that these are men who are simply the working poor, the men who exist in every community, and the men who, frankly, when things are back to normal and when they were normal before now, they're the people who are serving your meals at the different restaurants that we go to. So we still have those men that we care for. Now how we care for them has had to expand. We have always been involved very heavily here in food and trying to make sure that people have access to food. I think the blessing that I see coming out of all of this is that food access, people in many communities, people have looked at food access as an issue for certain parts of a community or certain segments of different types of people. But I think what we're seeing here in Pittsburgh is that issues around food equity are not limited to just one community. Issues of food equity go across the entire community. And so that's been a space that we've been involved in and will continue to be there. And then I think the other one for us is just trying to make sure that we can get out to people, and especially now reaching out to our seniors. We've had to be really creative about how we operate in this COVID space. And so now our work with seniors has been around trying to make sure that we can work to deal with some of the loneliness, some of the isolation, some of the despair that they're feeling. And for many of them, the calls that they get from us are the only calls that they're seeing every day.
So tell us how Pittsburgh has experienced the last couple decades, but also this moment. I've spent a fair bit of time there, and I've always thought there are a lot of different layers to Pittsburgh. Like there's a Carnegie Mellon layer that has had this big boom and recovery. There's an African-American sections downtown. Along the rivers, you've got the old steel towns that some of them they're pretty tough. How would you describe Pittsburgh to people?
Anthony Bourdain did one of his last shows was on Pittsburgh, and it was a hotly contested show for people here. There are many people who would say he didn't tell the story accurately, or that some people would say he didn't tell enough of the story. I think Pittsburgh has the same issues that we see in just about every community. I lived in Detroit for 10 years. I was in Miami for 3. And so I've seen issues of poverty and rage and waste and all types of issues that happen in every community. And it plays out here in Pittsburgh as well. Pittsburgh is a really great community from one standpoint that it is a very close, tight-knit community. Pittsburgh is the type of community where you'll see multiple generations of people who live within blocks of each other. It's the only city that I've been in where if you ask people what school they went to, they tell you their high school. So people are connected here at a level that I haven't seen, frankly, in a few other communities. But Pittsburgh still does have the same issues that I've seen play out in other communities. Yes, there are African-American sections of the community who feel tremendously left behind, who feel tremendously uninvested in the work that happens here in Pittsburgh. They feel like that they've been left apart. But yes, the business side of the community is very strong. Pittsburgh has survived through the recession of the past because it has a great diversity of different communities that are out there, business communities that has helped to keep it strong. So we still have issues. I'd like to say every community has issues. Show me that perfect community. I'd love to live there. I just don't think it exists. So our role, and in using some of your terminology, I would say our role as weavers is trying to understand that how do we make sure that we don't ignore those different aspects of communities that need help? Because Pittsburgh needs it just like any other community does.
Yeah. When you ask about how people, there's always a question people ask in every town to figure out where they place them. Like in Pittsburgh, I guess it's what high school did you go to? In New York, it's what do you do? In New Orleans, it's in rural South Carolina, it's who are your people? In New Orleans, it's like, who's your mama? Because I know your dad's name from your name, but I want to know who your mama's last name. So every place has that bond of community. I'm going to make some questions from the group here that I'm seeing on the screen, and also Habib is kind enough to text me a couple. And somebody asked, you mentioned you can't make the revenue. Why have you lost the revenue sources?
Can you repeat that question, please? Why
you mentioned earlier that the Y has lost its revenue stream. Is that simply the gym, or is that other things as well?
Oh, yeah. So in most YMCA's, membership revenues make up a very healthy percentage of what we bring in. In our particular case, membership revenue just itself will make up 31 to 35% of our revenue. Once you add into that the other program revenues that get lost from all the cute kids that take the swim lessons and the camp and all of that, that's another big piece. I talked about camp. Frankly, right now, we are hoping that we'll be able to operate a summer camp, but we know that at best, it will be in a limited format, that schools are not allowing us into their schools at this point. So we will have fewer locations. We will have to operate with different ratios than what we've had in the past. So we know that our capacity there will be significantly down. But if you look at just this window of time from roughly March 13th until today, our primary revenue during this time frame would have been membership revenue and the other revenues coming from other programs and services and after school programming as well, which obviously we're out of that business now. So that's a challenge of really every Y across the country.
Right. There's a question, maybe we can both, I'm going to let you take the first whack at it, and then maybe I'll take a whack. And the question is, what are your thoughts on how career aspirations and opportunities will shift because of this pandemic?
I've shared with my family, my friends, in 25 years in the Y, I've always known what's ahead. I may not have known exactly which position I was going to end in, but I always knew what the future is. When you talk about career aspirations now, I don't know exactly what the future is. I know that Ys will have to change. I know how we look will change. I know how we staff things will likely change. I know that before this whole pandemic crisis, I never would have considered the need, the imperative that we have now to make sure that we have a social media director in place. That's going to be critical for us. So I think in many ways we have to re-examine how we create career structures with what we now know as a new reality.
Yeah, I was thinking
at the level of the organization.
Yeah, we've started a couple of years ago, mostly because a lot of the columns I was writing for my newspaper were about social isolation, about people who are disconnected and fragmented. And I realized that, like in the World War II generation, they had Pearl Harbor happen and they marched off to volunteer to do something. They felt called. And we don't have anything as dramatic as Pearl Harbor, but when 75, 80,000 people die of opiate addiction every year, it seemed like a silent Pearl Harbor to me. Or when 45,000 young people kill themselves every year, it seemed like a silent Pearl Harbor. When you look at the disparities, it seemed like time to do something extra. And hanging around the Weavers, one thing I've noticed about them is that they have certitude that they're in the right place. Yeah. It's not like, oh, I'm going to help people for a few years, then I'll go back into finance. Nobody ever says that. Yeah. They're doing the right thing, and they have moral certitude. And I always tell the young people, the wrong question to ask when you're growing up is, what do I want from life? Because you don't know. You don't know. Yeah, right. And the right question to ask is, what is life asking of me?
Yeah.
And what are my circumstances?
I'm sorry. I've always believed, to your point, that we're put here on this planet to make a difference. that if the only thing that you can do, and I even have it on my Twitter account, we're put here on this planet to make a difference before it's our time to check out. If it's your time to check out and all you can talk about is how much money that you earned or raised or whatever, but can't talk about how you made this big blue marble any better, what's the use of the time?
Right. Right. Okay, here's a question from Kathy Gale, I see in the chat. Do you think that today's good intentions related to helping seniors and others in need will continue after the emergency subsides? You mentioned
I do. I think when you look at how the statistics start to track out from a generational standpoint, within the next 20 years, you'll have the first wave of the millennial group start to make it into what will be defined as a senior group, 50 and over. So with the millennials still in, then you've got, my group still definitely in. You've got a large population of the community that's aging at a rate that's pretty fast right now. So I think let's attack it from two different sides and say from a mission standpoint. From a mission standpoint, yes, there will always be organizations that will see the need to serve and to find better ways to serve our senior populations. From a business standpoint, that will drive organizations into finding more creative ways to serve seniors. Just a sheer number of the percent of the population that will be defined as senior, I think at that time will continue.
Yeah. One of the good piece of good news to me before this hit, which I think will continue, was people want their older relatives to live with them more than they used to.
Right.
And so when you ask people, when builders would ask home buyers who wanted to build a home, do you want to have a senior suite or an in-law suite so your grandparents can live? 44% of home buyers said, yeah, I want that. Because you're seeing the rise in multi-generational homes. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to warehouse them in a senior citizen center. They want them. And so I think that's part of the trend already. And hopefully this will extend it because people sort of see the weaknesses of some of the way we're warehousing old people now. Here's another question. How will falling percentage of trust impact organizations like the Y going forward? How can you turn that around? How do you build, there's a lot of earned distrust in communities. How do you build trust?
Yeah, I appreciate your comments on trust. I do think it exists. I do think that many of us in the nonprofit space, though, we're naturally designed to combat that. When all of this pandemic kind of descended upon all of us, and I'll just talk very personally about us here in Pittsburgh, we've tried to, number one, be more forthright with our members, more forthright with our foundation community, more forthright with the community in general. We're seeing more and more people lean in. And yeah, I can appreciate the lack of trust, but I just think that it's our nature in the work that we do in a nonprofit space to counteract that in the everyday work that we do. When we go out, and just last week, we did a food distribution and gave away, I think it was around 350 to 400 bags of food. That builds trust. Right. We're not talking about putting 350 people on a treadmill. We're giving people critical food that they need to operate just to be able to live from one week to another. We're talking with another partner now that's going to help us to be able to distribute as much as 800 boxes of food going into next month. That builds trust. So I think, I like to believe that nonprofits might be that bubble of civility that allows us as a community to come together and be strong.
Yeah, I was talking to some people in Baltimore. I mentioned they built this distribution network for 1,500 families. And the problem with the school lunch program in the time of pandemic, you had to take the bus to go to the school to pick up the meal. Right. And they got mass buying power. So they were buying lots of groceries. They could drive the price down. They got trucks to bring it to people's homes. So they built a system that'll probably last after this is done. It'll be the summer school program now. Mm-hmm. It'll just be how it's done. And this lady said to me, I feel I could do more now. Whoever was in there who used to be stopping me from doing stuff, somehow they're not there right now. So I can get a lot of stuff done right now. It's sort of hopeful. And the those food chains, we have a good question, which I don't know the answer to. It's Kevin's comments about food made me think about the supply chain conversation, how nationalized everything has become. What about in rural areas? How is the food distribution networks working there? And frankly, I don't know the answer to that. I've spoken to a lot of people, but
now, the thing that I would add to it is even in the rural networks, and this is where I have to do the shameless YMCA plug, there are 800 plus YMCAs across the country. And the majority of them are in small rural communities.
yeah.
I think look to those organizations, look to those type of sister organizations like that are out there, because they're trying to find ways to be more productive and more useful to their community now more so than ever.
Yeah, one thing you guys got, you're not going anywhere. Like you will be there. I find a lot of the distrust I find in communities is because somebody got a grant, they came into the neighborhood for 3 years, the grant ran out, they disappeared, and then people think, well, they just came and left. But you guys are staying. We've got about 5 minutes left. Let's ask about a good question. What are opportunities for nonprofits like the Y to step out of their comfort zones and play new roles in building resilient communities? Are there things the Y has gotten into a rut of we do this, but maybe we should be more involved in something else?
Yeah, one of our execs, he has always been the one who's reminded us that at times the Y might try to act like the bully on the block. And I'll just say that us here in Pittsburgh, and maybe that's been the position that the Y has taken some time. And by that, what we mean is that we haven't been as open to partnerships. We haven't been as open to alliances. And I'll say that was a while back. When you talk about getting out of your comfort zone, for us, it's understanding and making sure that the community knows that, as I always say when I go into different community meetings, I don't really have a pride of authorship around the work that happened. You know, I was talking about this other partner that we're working with now to distribute these food boxes. When we get into that work, I'm not looking for that to be something that the Y does. In fact, yes, we'll make sure that the Y parking lot is open because it just makes the best sense for it from a logistics standpoint. But that event is going to be much better received and amplified by the community when it's all of these other partners doing it. I think the other thing when you talk about getting out of your comfort zone is that so YMCAs across the country operate lots of different space from a real estate standpoint, but we're always trying to find better ways to utilize that space. In our local community here, we've had conversations with lots of different partners about, hey, do you want to come in and provide programs and services in our Y? That doesn't need to be a Y program, but if it's something that that complements the work that we do so we can be a better service to the community, then let's do that. Y work looks different in every community. And so when it's getting out of the box, I would always ask people to think about, well, what's the box of your community? And how then can your Y then stretch past that particular box on the local level?
Yeah. Well, Maggie Osborne in the chat function says YMCA parking lots for farmers markets. I don't know if you guys have parking lots in Pittsburgh, but
Absolutely.
that's a good. Finally, just give us a sense of some of the, over the course of your career, we just got 2 minutes left, just some of the enriching, the sort of the rewarding moments where the Y or you personally have seen something turn around, seen the change in a person's life, or seen something that, you know, this is why I do this.
I do this because of the phenomenal number of volunteers who I've had a chance to interact with over 25 years. The volunteers at the different Ys I've been involved in are the people who have kept me involved in this movement. They've been the best men at my weddings. They have been phenomenal people who have helped to really bridge the Ys together. And when you talk about the warm fuzzies that I get from the Y, it's being able to look through their eyes at how they look at the work that we do. I could tell you too many different stories. I couldn't begin to think of the different number of stories of how we've impacted people and the different members. But I think back to so many of these different volunteers who have poured in their personal time, their dollars, their professional clout, anything they can to making sure that the work that we do, that we're advancing that work moves me to no end.
Yeah. And since I've been involved in this Weaver work, I mentioned a lot of young people think human beings are primarily motivated by self-interest and selfishness. And I can tell you that's not true. There are some people who are, but there are a lot of people who really are, they live for others.
Yeah.
And they live to give, and they live to live life as a gift. And it's been so uplifting to be around those people. Frankly, when I go back to the other half of my life and I interview a bunch of politicians, I think, you self-absorbed jerk. I can be like these people. So, Kevin, our time is up. I'm going to invite Habib to come back and tell us what to do next. But thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for the work Y is doing. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Thank you all for joining in.